When I was working 5 jobs a day in New York City, a coworker once joked that it was no surprise to see any kind of luxury car on the streets, but there was one rule. If you ever saw someone driving a Cadillac the Beast with 4 6s on the license plate, whatever you do, don't mess with them. I never paid it any mind, though, because my girlfriend was someone I'd found, a sweet, clueless girl with no memory of her past. I was just saving up enough money to take her back to my hometown and marry her. Then one day, her memory suddenly returned, and she realized she was the heiress to a New York dynasty. She moved me out of our $200 a month apartment and into a 20,000 square foot mansion. But from that day forward, the Chloe who had loved me more than life itself was gone. She wore designer gowns, adorned herself with priceless jewelry, and negotiated $100 million deals. She started staying out all night, and soon, rumors of her romance with the Sterling family's heir were the talk of the city. My heart felt like it was being torn apart. I finally understood that she was now living in the clouds while I was still stuck in the mud. It was time for me to leave. So that same day, I called Mrs. Hayes and agreed to her terms. $25 million. Leave the country within a week and stay away from my daughter forever. Mrs. Hayes sat across from me, her face a mask of undisguised contempt. It was all there in black and white. Once I signed, there was no turning back. I nodded calmly, took the check, and walked away. After finalizing my immigration paperwork, I came home to find Julian Sterling in the living room, laughing and joking with Chloe. When he saw me, he immediately stood up and said with a smirk, "Ethan, my parents are insisting Chloe take me to the auction tonight. Don't get the wrong idea." I looked at Chloe, but she was busy adjusting her dress, not even sparing me a glance. "I'm not," I said softly. "What you two do has nothing to do with me." Chloe's hands froze, and her brow tightened. She opened her mouth to speak, but Julian cut her off. "Why don't you come with us, Ethan? It's not like you have anything better to do." Before I could refuse, Julian had already grabbed my arm and pulled me into the car. The auction house was dazzling with light. Chloe sat in the front row, winning bid after bid on extravagant pieces of jewelry, which she would then casually hand over to Julian beside her. Julian would smile tenderly, leaning in to whisper in her ear from time to time. Their intimacy was a painful sight. "Chloe, shouldn't we buy something for Ethan too?" he suggested, feigning thoughtfulness. Chloe's tone was flat. No, he wouldn't be comfortable with things like this. Hearing this, the corner of Julian's mouth lifted. From an angle where Chloe couldn't see, he shot me a triumphant smile. I lowered my gaze, my fingertips tracing the edge of the auction catalog in my hands, a cold emptiness spreading through my chest. Was it that I wouldn't be comfortable or that I wasn't worthy? In her eyes, I suppose I would always be the poor kid from the slums. Even standing next to her now, I was fundamentally unworthy of such luxury. But it didn't matter. Soon enough, there would be nothing between us at all. I sat quietly in the corner, watching Chloe spend a fortune on Julian, watching them act so intimately as if no one else existed, as if I were just an insignificant spectator. That was until the final item was presented for bidding, a jade pendant. My breath caught in my throat, and my fingers clenched into a fist without me even realizing it. It was my grandmother's heirloom. 3 years ago, Chloe had taken a job washing skyscraper windows to buy me a birthday present. She fell from the building and nearly died. To scrape together the money for her surgery, I had been forced to sell the only thing my grandmother had ever left me. Later, when I finally had enough money to buy it back, the pendant had already been sold. I searched every antique shop in the city, but I never saw it again. And now, here it was, appearing so suddenly before my very eyes. A surge of hope went through me, and I raised my paddle almost instinctively. 100,000. Julian looked back at me, stunned, then let out a soft laugh and raised his own paddle. 300,000, 400,000, 500,000. After we went back and forth a few more times, Chloe frowned, her eyes darting between Julian and me. Finally, she simply raised her hand, making an uncontested final bid and winning the pendant for the highest price of the night. The auctioneer's gavel came down. "Congratulations, Ms. Hayes." As the room buzzed with excitement, she turned to Julian and said, "Since you like it so much, it's yours." The bidding paddle fell from my hand, clattering onto the floor. I watched in a daze as a staff member respectfully presented the pendant to Julian, who reached for it with a smile playing on his lips. Just as his fingertips brushed the edge of the box, he let out a sudden, "Oops!" crash. The jade pendant slid out of the box and shattered on the marble floor, breaking in two. In that instant, my breath stopped, and the only thing I could hear was the sharp, piercing sound of it breaking. My mind went completely blank. I acted on pure instinct, shoving Julian aside as I rushed forward, my hands trembling as I reached for the broken pieces on the floor. Chloe's expression turned icy. She steadied a stumbling Julian, and when she looked back at me, her voice was low and sharp. "Ethan, what do you think you're doing?" I looked up, my eyes burning, my voice shaking. "What am I doing? That was my grandmother's heirloom. Didn't you once promise me that if you ever saw it again, you would buy it back for me? But now you don't even remember it, do you?" Chloe froze for a second, as if a memory had surfaced, but her eyes quickly turned cold again. "That was so long ago. How could I possibly remember?" Her voice was frigid, tinged with anger. "Besides, Julian didn't mean to do it. How could you just shove him like that?" Julian's eyes welled up with tears as he clutched her sleeve, looking utterly pathetic. "I'm so sorry, it's all my fault." Chloe's brow furrowed. She gently wiped his tears away, her voice soft. "It's not your fault." Then she shot me a cold look, her tone absolute. "I'll have the pendant repaired. Stop making a scene." With that, she wrapped an arm around Julian's shoulders and walked away with the 2 broken pieces, never once looking back. I stood frozen, watching them disappear, my heart feeling as though a piece had been carved right out of my chest, the pain so intense it was hard to breathe. By the time the auction ended, a cold rain had started to fall. I stood at the entrance, watching Chloe's black Maybach speed away with Julian inside. The venue was in a remote area, and after waiting for 30 minutes without finding a cab, I had no choice but to start walking home in the downpour. By the time I got home, my feet were numb with pain. I managed a quick shower before collapsing into bed and pulling the covers over my head. I tried not to think about what had happened recently. The moment I did, an overwhelming wave of grief and pain would wash over me. No one understood that I never wanted Chloe Hayes, the New York heiress. I just wanted the Chloe who squeezed into that tiny, run-down apartment with me, the one who would laugh softly and call me Ethan. But that girl was gone, and she was never coming back. I closed my eyes and let the tears stream down my face. The next day around noon, the sound of the door opening startled me awake. "Hilu was standing by my bed. There's a family dinner tonight. You're coming with me." I didn't want her to suspect anything before I left, so after a moment of silence, I nodded. The Hayes mansion was ablaze with lights. As I followed Chloe inside, the first person I saw was Julian, sitting comfortably on the sofa. He was dressed in an elegant Chanel suit, chatting warmly with Mrs. Hayes while Mr. Hayes stood by, smiling and nodding. It was a picture of domestic bliss. "Chloe, you're here." Mrs. Hayes greeted her warmly, completely ignoring me as she took her daughter's arm. "Julian has been waiting for you." Chloe paused, instinctively glancing back at me. She probably expected to see hurt in my eyes, or at least a pained expression, but I just stood there calmly, as if none of it concerned me. "Oh, Ethan is here too." Julian feigned surprise, then smiled warmly. "Come on, have a seat. Make yourself at home." Mrs. Hayes finally glanced my way, her voice cold. "Since you're here, try to behave yourself. Don't embarrass our family." I said nothing. At the dinner table, Mrs. Hayes and Julian gossiped about their social circle, while Mr. Hayes and Chloe discussed business. Not a single person spoke to me. I felt invisible, quietly eating my food while Mrs. Hayes's thinly veiled insults filled the air. Marrying into the right family is so important. Some people just don't know their place. Julian and Chloe grew up together. They know everything about each other. They're such a perfect match. I had heard it all countless times before. In the beginning, Chloe would cut her off with a cold look. Later, she would just frown and say, "Mom, that's enough." Now she didn't even bother to frown. I lowered my head and sipped my soup. The hot liquid slid down my throat but couldn't warm my frozen heart. After dinner, Chloe drove us home. Julian naturally slid into the passenger seat, leaving me to sit alone in the back. A song Julian liked was playing on the stereo, and he laughed with Chloe as they discussed the dinner party. I stared out the window at the blurred neon lights, suddenly remembering a winter years ago. I was giving Chloe a ride home on my second-hand bike, and she wrapped her arms around my waist, tucking her frozen hands into my coat pockets to keep them warm. "Ethan," she'd said, "when I'm rich, I'll buy a nice car so you'll never have to be cold again." Well, now she was rich, but I wasn't the one in her passenger seat. A pair of blinding headlights suddenly flashed in front of us. Before I could even react, I saw a truck swerving wildly, heading straight for us. In the deafening crash that followed, the last thing I saw was Chloe throwing herself towards the passenger seat without a moment's hesitation, using her own body to shield Julian. Meanwhile, inertia threw me violently against the front seat. My head slammed into the windshield, and blood instantly blurred my vision. In the final second before I lost consciousness, I could have sworn I heard the sound of my own heart breaking. It turned out that even in a moment of life and death, I was no longer the one she chose to protect. When I woke up again, I was in a hospital bed, aching so badly I could barely move. I had just managed to sit up when the door swung open and Mrs. Hayes strode in on her high heels. "Ethan, didn't I tell you to leave the country?" She looked down at me with disdain. "You're still here? Still clinging to the fantasy of marrying into the Hayes family?" I looked at her calmly. "Don't worry. As soon as my visa is approved, I'll be gone." I paused, then added, "I'll go so far away she'll never be able to find me." Mrs. Hayes sneered. "I certainly hope so." Just as she finished speaking, the door opened again. Chloe was standing in the doorway, her expression grim. "Go where? Who's leaving?" I lowered my eyes and lied. "Your mother came to check on me. I told her I was fine and that she could go." Seeing her cue, Mrs. Hayes offered a few words of feigned concern before making an excuse about having business to attend to and leaving. The two of us were left alone in the room. Chloe walked over to the bed, her voice stiff. "The crash happened so fast. I didn't have time to think. I just hummed softly. I know. It's okay." Chloe seemed taken aback. "You're not angry?" "No." Chloe stared into my eyes, searching for any sign of hurt or anger, but my expression was as still and lifeless as a pool of stagnant water. She suddenly seemed frustrated and reached out to touch my face. "Stop being difficult, Ethan. I'm really not angry." I turned my head away from her touch, my voice quiet but firm. "I need to rest. Julian was hurt too. You should go be with him." With that, I closed my eyes and turned my back to her. I sensed her standing there for a long time before she finally closed the door and left. Over the next few days, Chloe came to visit every day. She would sit by my bed, working on documents, and occasionally ask if I was in pain. I always shook my head, but every time I woke up, the chair beside my bed was empty. I would only overhear the nurses whispering to each other. "That Mr. Sterling in the VIP room next door, his girlfriend is amazing. She stays with him all night. I heard she's the heiress to the Hayes Corporation. So beautiful and devoted." I closed my eyes and pretended I hadn't heard a thing. The day I was discharged, Chloe came to pick me up herself. I slowly dragged my still healing body to the car, but froze as I reached for the door handle. Julian was sitting in the passenger seat. He gave me a gentle smile. "You don't mind if I catch a ride, do you, Ethan? I get a bit carsick, so I really need to sit up front." Chloe frowned, looking like she wanted to explain, but I spoke before she could. "It's fine." I calmly got into the back seat, watching the two of them in front of me like a complete outsider. Chloe glanced at me in the rearview mirror, her lips parted as if to say something, but in the end, she remained silent. The car pulled up to a lavish mansion, and I realized Chloe wasn't taking me home. She had brought me to the golden wedding anniversary of a respected elder in her social circle. "Isn't that Ms. Hayes? Why did she bring 2 dates? The one in the white shirt must be Ethan, right? I heard he's from the slums. A very ordinary background. Mr. Sterling and Ms. Hayes are the real match. They're from the same world." The guests' chatter was loud and clear, but I stood quietly in a corner, pretending not to hear any of it. Chloe stayed by Julian's side the entire time, fetching him drinks, putting his jacket over his shoulders. Her eyes filled with a tenderness so deep it looked like it could melt. "Ethan, let me introduce you to some friends," Julian said, suddenly appearing beside me. He linked his arm through mine familiarly. Before I could pull away, he had dragged me over to a group of arrogant rich kids. "This is Ethan, Chloe's boyfriend," Julian announced with a smile. Then he abruptly switched to fluent German, launching into a conversation with the others. They were surprised for a moment, but quickly recovered and joined in, laughing and chatting away in German. I stood there like an island, completely isolated by a wall of language I couldn't understand. "Ethan," Julian suddenly said to me in English, "what do you think?" "What? Oh, my apologies. I forgot you don't speak German." Julian put on an apologetic face, then turned to the others to explain. "Ethan hasn't studied any foreign languages. Please don't mind him." A few soft snickers rippled through the group, each one feeling like a tiny needle piercing my heart. "It's all right, he can always learn," Julian said, patting my hand. His tone was so gentle, it was as if he were comforting a small, simple-minded child. I looked down, my fingernails digging into my palms. Under their gazes, a mixture of mockery and pity, I felt like a clown on public display. Just then, the host announced a little game. Couples were invited to perform a piano duet on stage, with the best performance winning a set of valuable designer watches. Julian's eyes lit up. He tugged on Chloe's sleeve like a spoiled child. I've wanted those watches for ages. Chloe, my birthday is coming up. Could you and Ethan win them for me? The rich kids around them burst out laughing. Julian, you're putting him on the spot. The guy doesn't even speak German. How is he supposed to know how to play the piano? That's for high society. Why don't you and Ms. Hayes play together? Someone suggested. Julian looked at Chloe. Could we? Chloe gave a slight nod. Fine. Julian shot me a smug look. Well then, I'll just borrow Chloe for a bit. The two of them walked onto the stage, and the moment the first notes sounded from the piano, the entire room fell silent. Julian's fingers danced across the keys, and Chloe's accompaniment was flawless. They played as if they were the real couple, perfectly in sync. The guests murmured in admiration. Down below, I was surrounded by Julian's friends. See that, Ethan? Now that's a power couple. A hick like you who can't speak German or play the piano. What makes you think you're good enough for the Hayes heiress? If you have any sense, you'll get out of here now. A poor kid trying to marry into a fortune. Don't make a fool of yourself. Their grating laughter felt like shards of glass in my ears. I clenched my fists and turned to leave, but someone stuck out a foot and tripped me. I hit the floor hard, and a searing pain shot through my entire body. Before I could even catch my breath, a red stiletto heel pressed down on my wrist. Oh, I'm so sorry, the socialite who had stepped on me said with fake surprise, maliciously grinding her heel into my hand. I didn't see you there. I heard a sickening crack. The pain was so intense my vision swam. Instinctively, I looked up toward the stage, toward Chloe. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. All I could do was plead with my eyes for her to help me, and she did look over, for just a single glance. Then, as if she were looking at a complete stranger, she coolly turned her gaze away and went back to turning the pages of the sheet music for Julian. I bit down hard on my lip, refusing to let myself make a sound. I remembered 3 years ago, when I'd gotten a small cut on my finger while working at a grocery store. Chloe had been so worried she'd skipped her own shift to rush over and drag me to a clinic to get it bandaged. The doctor said it was nothing, but she stubbornly stayed by my side all night, terrified I might get an infection and run a fever. And now, as my bones were being crushed under someone's heel, she couldn't even be bothered to look at me. Chloe and Julian shared a smile, looking like a prince and princess from a fairy tale. Ah! The sharp heel ground down again, and I heard the distinct, sickening crunch of my wrist bone breaking. Excruciating pain flooded every nerve in my body. My vision started to twist and blur. In the last moment before everything went black, I heard the piano music end, followed by a roar of applause. When I woke up, the air in the hospital room was thick with the smell of antiseptic. A doctor was explaining my condition to Chloe. Ms. Hayes, Ethan's wrist has suffered a comminuted fracture. Even after it heals, there will be permanent damage. He'll never be able to lift heavy objects again. The pain will be immense, and he'll likely have trouble sleeping for the next month. You must ensure he has proper care. The color drained from my face. I instinctively tried to lift my hand to grab the glass of water on the nightstand, but a sharp, stabbing pain from my wrist caused me to knock it over. Crash! The sound of shattering glass made both the doctor and Chloe turn around. After the doctor left with a sigh, Chloe hurried to my bedside and poured me a new glass of water. She handed it to me, her brow furrowed. She seemed to struggle for words before finally speaking. I'm sorry. I was playing the piano, I didn't see you fall. Does it still hurt? I looked at her face, and the first thing I saw in my mind was the way she had looked at Julian so tenderly at the piano. Had she not seen me, or had she simply not cared? I slowly closed my eyes, fighting back the ache in my chest, and said, word by word, I'm calling the police. Chloe stared at me, stunned. What? Didn't you hear the doctor? I held up my casted arm, my eyes burning but refusing to shed tears. My hand is ruined. Shouldn't the people who did this face the consequences? Chloe's expression grew complicated. It just means you can't lift heavy things. Things are different now. With me here, you won't ever have to do that kind of work again. She paused. They're Julian's friends. If you press charges, it will be very embarrassing for him. Do you really have to make things so difficult? I bit my lip so hard I could taste blood. So, just to save Julian from embarrassment, I was supposed to just swallow this? I'm calling the police. Chloe was silent for a moment, then suddenly pulled out her checkbook. If you insist on making this an issue, then I'll pay you on their behalf. The scratching of the pen on the check was deafeningly loud in the quiet room. Every stroke felt like a knife twisting in my heart. As she wrote the first digit, I bit down harder, the metallic taste of blood filling my mouth. When she saw I wasn't taking it, she must have thought the amount was too low. She tore up the check and started writing a new one. One, then another, and another. The amount on the check kept climbing. When she finally handed me a check for $15 million, I suddenly remembered a rainy night 3 years ago. We were living in a tiny 100-square-foot apartment. She had worked overtime until 3 in the morning and came home soaked from the rain, but she still smiled as she pulled me into her arms. "Ethan," she'd whispered, "I'm going to make $1 million so you'll never have to suffer again." She had fulfilled her promise, just not in the way I ever imagined. She could now write a check for $15 million without a second thought, but it was to buy silence for the people who had crushed me. $15 million, is that enough? She asked, holding out the check. My hand trembled as I took the flimsy piece of paper from her. Then I started to laugh. I laughed until tears streamed down my face, splashing onto the check and blurring the ink. "It's enough." My voice was so hoarse it was unrecognizable. "Chloe, you finally kept your promise." She looked at me, confused, a slight frown on her face, as if she had no idea what I was talking about. How could she possibly understand? The Chloe who held me tight in our tiny apartment and promised to make $1 million so I could have a good life was long dead. She had died so completely that not a single trace of her remained. After that day, Chloe never came back to the hospital. But every morning at 10 o'clock sharp, her assistant would arrive, carrying exquisitely wrapped gift boxes of nutritional supplements. Today it was a box of rare bird's nest soup. Yesterday it was cordyceps mushrooms, the day before imported collagen. "Ms. Hayes asked me to let you know that she's been extremely busy with work," the assistant would say, standing by my bed with a tone that was both respectful and distant. "She wants you to focus on your recovery." I would just nod, my eyes landing on the growing pile of unopened boxes on my nightstand. The gold foil logos on the packaging gleamed in the sun, just as bright and dazzling as Chloe's life had become. After the assistant left, I opened my phone and saw that Julian had updated his Facebook. It was a photo of him leaning on Chloe's shoulder against the backdrop of the turquoise waters and blue skies of the Maldives. The caption read, "Thanks to a certain someone for making time for me in her busy schedule." I stared at the picture for a long, long time until my eyes began to burn. So this was what she meant by too busy. She was busy on vacation in the Maldives with Julian. Just as I was about to lock my phone, a new text message popped up. Finally, it was all coming to an end. I wouldn't have to count the seconds waiting for her to come home anymore. I wouldn't have to eat cold dinners alone in the middle of the night. I wouldn't have to endure Mrs. Hayes's scornful looks. And most importantly, I could finally let go of the part of myself that was still clinging to memories, sobbing in agony. The next afternoon, I checked out of the hospital and went straight to the visa center to pick up my passport and ticket. When I got back to the mansion, Chloe and Julian were standing in the living room talking while bodyguards carried luggage into one of the guest rooms. When they saw me, they both turned to look. Chloe lowered her gaze and began to explain. "Julian's parents are traveling abroad, and he was afraid to be home alone, so he's going to stay here for a little while. The Hayes and the Sterlings are old family friends, and our companies have a partnership, so it's my duty to look after him." She didn't need to explain anything to me. As of today, we had nothing to do with each other. I just nodded and started up the stairs. "Oh, by the way," Julian called out, stopping me. "Chloe and I are going to a musical later. Do you want to come, Ethan?" Before I could answer, Chloe spoke for me. "His hand is still injured. He should stay home and rest. Besides, he wouldn't understand it anyway." I stopped on the stairs and turned back with a pale smile. She's right. I wouldn't understand. Shortly after they left, I finished packing my things. I stood in the middle of the bedroom, looking around the space that had once held so many of my dreams, now feeling nothing but desolate. Our photo was still on the coffee table. In it, Chloe's eyes were so tender, as if I were the only person in her world. I gently ran my fingers over the frame, then turned it face down. I walked to the front door, left my key on the console table in the foyer, and quietly closed the door behind me. 3 years ago, on a stormy night, I found a girl covered in blood in an alleyway. Felt like finding a fallen star. Now, 3 years later, I was leaving quietly, dragging my suitcase behind me. The lights of the mansion faded in the distance, as if that star had never shone in my life at all. Meanwhile, at the theater, the music swelled and the performers took the stage, but a vague sense of unease settled over Chloe. A strange anxiety made her restless. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to slip from her grasp. The musical ended, but she had been so distracted she couldn't have said what it was about. A voice in her head was screaming at her to go home. The moment the curtain fell, Chloe shot to her feet, acting on pure instinct. Her abrupt movement startled Julian. Seeing her heading for the exit, he hurried after her. Chloe, Chloe, what's wrong? Didn't you like the show? Hearing his voice, Chloe paused and glanced back at him before shaking her head. No, I just remembered something I have to do. I'll have a car sent to take you home. Without another word, she turned and walked away, ignoring Julian calling after her. Julian had no idea what he'd done to upset her and make her leave so abruptly. He thought about what she'd said and scoffed. Even if she was angry, it didn't matter. The marriage alliance was already a done deal, and with their company's partnership on the line, nothing could really go wrong. Chloe didn't know what was wrong with her. Even as she stood in front of the mansion's door, she still felt dazed. She pushed open the heavy front door, stepped inside, and instinctively called out the familiar name, Ethan. But the seconds ticked by, and there was no answer. It was then she remembered that I hadn't answered her when she called my name for a long time now. When had that started? It seemed to have started the day I confronted her with a photo of her on a date with Julian, my eyes filled with tears, asking her what was going on. She had impatiently tossed the photo in the trash and dismissed me. I told you, it was a business meeting. Why do you keep bringing up things that aren't true? Chloe couldn't remember how I had reacted, only that from that day on, I had grown quieter and more distant. I had certainly been through a lot lately, but that was okay. She would make it up to me. With that thought, Chloe walked further into the house. But in an instant, she realized something was wrong. Things were missing. She frowned and scanned the room again. In the unnerving silence, her eyes widened in shock. Disbelief was written all over Chloe's face, and her breathing grew heavy. After frantically searching through room after room, checking every closet and drawer, she was forced to admit the truth. All of my things were gone. He was gone. But how was that possible? They had been together for 3 years, relying on each other for everything. Their bond was so deep. How could Ethan just leave without a word? Chloe refused to believe it. Her phone started ringing, but her mind was in turmoil, completely consumed by thoughts of Ethan. She had no energy to answer, letting it ring again and again. She didn't know how much time had passed before a sharp knock echoed from the front door. As if waking from a trance, Chloe went to open it. It was her mother. Seeing Chloe standing there perfectly fine, Mrs. Hayes frowned. Why weren't you answering your phone? But before Chloe could reply, her mother's eyes fell on the disheveled living room. What is all this? She demanded. It's a complete mess, and you were out with Julian today. How could you just leave him and come home by yourself? You know you two are getting married soon. Everything was going so well before. Her mother's voice droned on, but Chloe seemed to hear none of it, lost in her own world. Chloe, I'm talking to you. Are you even listening? Seeing her daughter was a million miles away, Mrs. Hayes waved a hand in front of her face, but Chloe didn't react, just kept muttering a name over and over. Ethan, Ethan, Ethan. Hearing the name, Mrs. Hayes frowned in annoyance, a flicker of contempt in her eyes. A poor boy with no family, who had only managed to latch onto the Hayes family because of Chloe's amnesia, gaining entry into a world he didn't belong in, but you couldn't hide his common origins with designer clothes. He and Chloe were destined to be worlds apart. Fortunately, the boy had some self-awareness and hadn't clung to Chloe indefinitely. Thinking this, Mrs. Hayes glanced at the ransacked living room, did a quick mental calculation, and a look of understanding, followed by satisfaction, crossed her face as she looked at her daughter. He's gone. He knew his place. It's for the best. I'll talk to the Sterlings about setting a wedding date when I get home. But something in her mother's words struck a nerve, and Chloe's expression changed dramatically. No, that's impossible. How could he leave me? He loved me so much. Seeing her daughter's certainty, Mrs. Hayes snorted. Why is it impossible? He took the $25 million without a moment's hesitation. $25 million? Chloe seized on the number, her head snapping up to look at her mother, her voice laced with disbelief. What did you say? What $25 million? Mrs. Hayes faltered, a flicker of regret in her eyes, but she quickly composed herself. She had hidden it from Chloe before, worried she wouldn't willingly break up with me if she knew. But he was gone now. Even if Chloe knew the truth, it wouldn't change anything. In fact, it might help her see him for who he really was, just another man blinded by money. Once she realized Ethan had only stayed for the money, she would have no reason to miss him. With that thought, Mrs. Hayes told her everything without reservation. I met with him a week ago. I gave him $25 million to leave you. I expected him to argue, to ask for more money, or to try and get more out of you. I never expected him to accept the check so readily and promise to be gone within a week. And counting the days, the timing is just about right. Chloe had never imagined this could be the reason. Her eyes began to burn, and she blinked rapidly against the stinging sensation. A suffocating pain seized her chest, making it hard to breathe. Chloe gritted her teeth, refusing to believe her mother. Her eyes were bloodshot as she stared at her, pleading for a different answer. You forced him to leave. He didn't want to go, right? But she was destined for disappointment. Mrs. Hayes shook her head, her expression nonchalant. Why would I lie to you? He's the one who called me. He's just a gold digger. He's not worth another thought. You're marrying Julian soon. You should be focusing your attention on him. Her eyes darted to her phone on the table. As if grabbing a lifeline, she snatched it up, found the number she had been deliberately ignoring for so long, and dialed. The line rang and rang, before an automated, emotionless female voice announced the call could not be completed. When she tried to call again, the line was dead. She stared at the screen in disbelief, as if she couldn't trust her own eyes. He had blocked her. Chloe didn't remember when her mother finally left. She sat stubbornly in the living room, her gaze fixed on the front door. In a daze, she thought she saw the door swing open and me walk in, just like I used to, rambling about my day. Chloe, you won't believe the crazy customer I had at work today. She reached out for him, but her hand closed on empty air. The image faded, but his voice still seemed to echo in her ears. It was only then that she realized it had all been a hallucination. The closed doors and shuttered windows blocked out all light, plunging the room into a darkness so complete she couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. Her phone, tossed aside, began to ring, its shrill tone shattering the silence. She didn't have the energy to answer it or even to look at it, but the caller was persistent. She didn't answer and they just kept calling back. The standoff continued for what felt like an eternity before Chloe finally gave in. She picked up the phone and saw Julian Sterling on the screen. A wave of irritation washed over her, and without a second thought, she declined the call and blocked his number. The room was finally quiet again. She let out a sigh of relief, but it wasn't long before another call came through, this time from an unknown number. Chloe didn't need to guess. She knew it was Julian. She declined and blocked the number in one smooth motion. She lay on her plush bed, staring blankly at the ceiling, my smiling face flashing in her mind again and again. She had never realized before just how much space he had taken up in her heart. But her solitude didn't last long. Julian showed up at her door. Chloe, what is your problem? He demanded, pushing the door open without knocking. His eyes filled with a mixture of anger and hurt. Julian had been more than willing to marry into the Hayes family. For him, it was a deal with no downsides. Chloe was beautiful, her family's status was equal to his, and he had, at first, played the part of the perfect gentleman. His only complaint was the boyfriend she'd picked up during her amnesia, the one she insisted on keeping around. But Mrs. Hayes had promised to get rid of Ethan, and Chloe always seemed to favor him when they were together, so he hadn't worried too much about it. That was until she'd come home yesterday and completely ghosted him, not returning his texts or calls. After making a few inquiries, he found out it was because Ethan had left. Julian had assumed she wouldn't care. Nothing in her past behavior suggested she was attached to Ethan, but here she was, locking herself in her room over it. Chloe barely glanced up. Seeing it was Julian, she lay back down, looking completely lifeless. He's a nobody, Chloe. Have you forgotten that I'm the one you're supposed to marry? Stung by her indifference, Julian stepped forward and tried to pull her up. The moment his cool hand closed around her wrist, a powerful feeling of revulsion washed over her. She shoved him away, a purely reflexive action. Caught completely off guard by her sudden shove, Julian stumbled backward and fell hard onto the floor. The pain shot through him, and tears immediately sprang to his eyes. Chloe, you pushed me? He asked in disbelief, the red rims of his eyes making him look fragile and hurt. She stared for a moment, as if just processing what she'd done. She wanted to explain but didn't know how, so she said nothing. Chloe didn't know what had come over her. She had known about the arranged marriage for a long time. In fact, she had initially agreed to it. She was the sole heiress of the Hayes Corporation, the most brilliant and celebrated of her generation. From a young age, she had always been the perfect child everyone else was compared to, the object of constant envy. They envied her intelligence, her family, her beauty. She was exceptional in every way. How could her future husband be a parentless orphan with no connections? Chloe had told herself time and time again that Ethan wasn't good enough for her, but she had never, ever considered the possibility that he would leave. She had planned to take care of him, even after she married Julian. She would make sure he never had to go back to that life of poverty, struggling for food and rent. But he had left, silently, decisively, without leaving her even the smallest opening to ask him to stay. It was only now, in his absence, that she realized that over those years of depending on each other, Ethan had become an inseparable part of her life. Looking at Julian, still crumpled on the floor, Chloe had to admit something to herself. She regretted it. 5 years later, a plane streaked across the azure sky, leaving a white contrail in its wake. A cold, imposing Chloe strode through the airport, her assistant struggling to keep up with the luggage cart, not daring to utter a word of complaint. Of course, the assistant wasn't the only one having a hard time keeping up. "Chloe, wait for me!" A man's anxious voice echoed through the terminal, but the woman ahead only quickened her pace. It wasn't that Julian didn't notice Chloe's coldness, but he couldn't bring himself to give up on something that had been so close to his grasp. 5 years ago, they had been one step away from the altar. He would have been her husband, but now he was still just her fiancé, trailing pathetically behind her, waiting for the day she might finally stop and wait for him. But it was always him chasing her. Over the years, the Hayes Corporation's power in San Francisco had grown exponentially, while the Sterling Group had slowly faded. The marriage alliance was perhaps the Sterling family's last hope for a comeback. If the Hayes Corporation would just lend them a hand, their fortunes could be revived. This was why, even after years of Chloe's cold shoulder, the Sterlings had never considered calling off the engagement. The airport was bustling, and Julian's calls didn't attract much attention, but they carried clearly to a man who had just deplaned nearby. I paused, instinctively looking toward the source of the voice. All I could see was the back of a person, mostly hidden by the crowd. I pulled my suitcase along, gazing through the terminal window at the sky, which felt both strange and familiar. I felt a momentary daze. 5 years had passed. I was no longer the destitute orphan I once was. I had become successful and self-assured. In a way, I had the Hayes family, and Chloe, to thank for their generosity. Without that $25 million, I have no idea what would have become of me, alone in a foreign country. But because of that money, I was able to finish the degree I'd been forced to abandon and land a good job. Thinking of this, I recalled the name I just heard and fell silent for a moment. When I left all those years ago, I never thought I would return. When I finally decided to come back, I knew I might run into people from my past. Over the past 5 years, I've had the same dream countless times. I dream of the night I found Chloe. It was late at night, and I had just finished one of my part-time jobs. On my way home, I saw a woman lying in a pool of her own blood. In that moment, my mind flashed to all the crime novels I'd read to de-stress. I thought I'd stumbled upon a mob hit. The desire to avoid trouble took over, and my first instinct was to walk away. But just then, she reached out and grabbed the cuff of my pants, using the last of her strength to say, "Help me, I'll repay you." Before she could finish, she passed out again. Back then, still struggling to make ends meet, I had no idea that Chloe was the sole heiress to the Hayes Corporation, one of the most powerful companies in San Francisco. Later, I often wondered if things would have been different. If I'd spent more time reading the news or celebrity gossip back then, maybe I would have known the truth sooner, and all the heartache that followed could have been avoided. But unfortunately, there are no what-ifs in life. Still, her clothes looked expensive, and I was thinking about that promised reward, so I took her to the hospital and paid her medical bills. I was so worried she'd wake up and run off that I even took a day off work just to watch over her. But I never imagined that after a full day of waiting, the news I'd get was that she had amnesia. She had forgotten who she was, and she had forgotten her promise to repay me. Stung by the cost of her medical bills and my lost wages, I decided to let her stay with me. She could work and earn money alongside me to make up for what she owed. And so she stayed for 3 years. We relied on each other, found comfort in each other, and during those difficult years, something more than friendship began to grow between us. She told me she loved me, that she was going to make a fortune and take care of me. She even secretly got my initials tattooed on her collarbone when I wasn't looking. When I saw it, the skin around the letters was still red and raw. She winced when I touched it, but she still forced a goofy smile when she saw me looking. That was the happiest I'd been since my parents passed away. I was naive enough to believe we could be that happy forever. Then her memory returned. She took me back to the Hayes estate and we moved into the mansion. But she was no longer the Chloe who had loved only me. The sudden ringing of my phone pulled me from my thoughts. I looked down at my phone, and seeing the name on the screen, I let out a quiet sigh of relief. Thank God all of that was in the past. Thank God I had a new life now, one that was entirely my own. I answered the call, and a clear, smooth voice came through the line. "Ethan, did you make it?" I nodded instinctively before remembering she couldn't see me. "Yeah, I landed safely," I said. How about you? I've hit a snag over here, Ava sighed. It might be a few more days before I can get back. The soft sound of her sigh through the phone made me smile. Is it serious? Nothing major, don't worry, Ethan. I'll be back in a week at the most. It just means you'll have to report to the new office on your own. Her answer put my mind at ease. But her last comment made the tips of my ears turn red. You're such a tease. After we hung up, I didn't linger. I grabbed my suitcase and headed for the exit, the breeze from my movement ruffling my hair. Elsewhere in the terminal, Chloe seemed to sense something. She turned her head toward the crowd, and in an instant, her eyes locked onto a familiar figure. Her pupils contracted. She froze, her entire body rigid, her eyes fixed on him, terrified that if she blinked, he would vanish. The next second, she spun around and broke into a run, only to collide squarely with Julian, who had been hurrying to catch up with her. Ms. Hayes! Two voices cried out at once. The impact sent Chloe stumbling, and by the time she looked up again, the figure she had been so desperate to reach was gone. Frustration and rage flooded her mind. Her body moved before she could think, and she slapped the man standing in front of her. The sharp crack of the slap silenced the area for a moment. Dozens of eyes, curious, mocking, entertained, turned toward them. Each glance felt like a dagger in Julian's back. The humiliation was instant and intense. The red handprint blooming on his cheek might as well have been a brand, marking him for public shame. His eyes welled with tears, his voice thick with hurt. Chloe, how could you hit me? Why would you do that? All he'd ever done was love her. How could she use that love against him, humiliate him like this? His pained, vulnerable expression earned him some sympathy from the onlookers, but none from Chloe. She watched his display of hurt with cold eyes. After a long moment, she sneered, "You could have chosen not to follow me." Her words silenced all of his complaints. It was true. He was the one who insisted on following her, the one who kept banging his head against a wall. In the end, he had brought this on himself. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why are you always so cruel to me?" Tears streamed down Julian's face. He couldn't understand. "You agreed to it. You agreed to marry me." She was the one who had given him hope, who had told him she was willing. 5 years ago, he had put on his tuxedo with a heart full of joy, believing it would be the happiest, most unforgettable moment of his life. But with a single, casual act, she had destroyed it all. She had left him at the altar, in front of all their guests. As the officiant smiled and asked if she would take him as her husband, Chloe had remained silent for a long, agonizing moment. Julian had prompted her again and again, until she finally seemed to snap out of her trance, her eyes meeting his with a look of cold resolve. And then, she uttered the words that stunned the entire room. I will not marry Julian Sterling." She dropped the ring, tossed her bouquet aside, and walked away without a moment's hesitation. The Sterling family became the laughingstock of their entire social circle, ridiculed for all their careful planning and scheming, only to end up with nothing. They weren't willing to take the humiliation lying down, of course, but in the ensuing power struggle between the two families, the Sterlings were the ones who lost every time. On the verge of being pushed out of the city's elite circles entirely, they had finally relented, bringing up the old marriage contract once more. They spun it as a gesture of understanding, claiming they realized Chloe simply hadn't been ready for marriage, and that they had been inconsiderate. The engagement was back on, but this time, all the power was in Chloe's hands. She gave Julian the same cold shoulder she had once given me. She allowed others to humiliate him, just as she had once allowed them to humiliate me. She wanted Julian to taste the same pain I had once endured. For the sake of his love for her, and for the sake of his family's alliance with the Hayes, Julian endured it all. But even so, in all those years, Chloe had never physically struck him. This was the first time, and she had done it in public. Finally, Julian couldn't take it anymore. As tears streamed from his eyes, he turned and ran. With the main players gone, the show was over. The crowd of onlookers began to disperse. Only the assistant remained, frozen in place, terrified and unsure of what to do next. Just then, Chloe finally moved. She looked at her petrified assistant and said only one thing: "Cancel the rest of my appointments for today." Before the assistant could even process her words, she was already far down the concourse. By the time he snapped out of it, she was gone. It wasn't long, however, before Mrs. Hayes called. "What happened? I heard you canceled your meeting with Mr. Kim." Chloe started to say, about to tell her mother who she'd seen, but she stopped herself. She suddenly remembered that her mother was one of the people who had forced me away. The name died in her throat. After a moment of silence, she decided to keep it to herself. "It's nothing." Mrs. Hayes could tell she was hiding something, but she knew better than to press the issue. Now that Chloe was in charge of the Hayes Corporation, no one could force her to say anything she didn't want to. She let it drop. Besides, there were other ways to find out what had happened. After a pause, she changed the subject. I heard you slapped Julian in public today. Chloe didn't deny it, or rather, she didn't seem to care, simply humming in affirmation. Hearing this, Mrs. Hayes sighed. What are you playing at? If you really don't like Julian, then just send him away for good. Don't give him false hope while treating him so coldly. Chloe didn't explain her reasoning. Her voice remained cool and distant. I have my reasons. Of course, she wasn't going to let Julian off the hook that easily. Not until Ethan was back by her side. She wouldn't let him go. She could wait as long as it took. Fortunately, she wouldn't have to wait long. I saw Chloe again a week after I returned to San Francisco. I had just finished my onboarding at the new firm and received my title as senior architect when my boss handed me a contract. The client specifically requested you for this project. Ethan, this is a huge deal. If you can land this, our new branch will be firmly established in the city. You have to close this. I stared at the proposal that had been thrust into my hands, a flicker of doubt crossing my face. They specifically requested me? I frowned, a feeling of unease settling in. Although I was originally from San Francisco, I used to be just another person struggling to get by, worrying about my next paycheck. Later, even with my connection to Chloe and the Hayes family, very few people ever took me seriously. After that, I went to London. I spent 2 years studying architecture, and another 3 years working my way up from a junior designer to a senior position. I had made a small name for myself, but I certainly wasn't famous enough for a client to request me by name, especially since I had just returned to the States. Here, I was basically an unknown. Why would anyone specifically ask for me? Then a thought occurred to me. I looked up at my director, Lisa. If I'm going to be the one to negotiate, I should at least know who the client is. When Lisa didn't answer right away, I pressed on. So, the client is... Lisa broke into a wide, proud grin. The Hayes Corporation. The air in the room went still. I had expected as much, but holding the contract in my hands, I was silent for a long time. Lisa, however, seemed oblivious to my reaction. She took a sip of water and started laying it on thick. Ethan, if you told me you had connections at a company like Hayes Corp, I would have just given you my job. Why settle for a senior architect position? I shook my head, my expression grim. I looked down and was quiet for a moment before I spoke. I don't have any connections there, and even if I did, I'd want to earn the director position on my own merit. Lisa was taken aback. She clearly hadn't expected that response. She studied me for a moment, then a slow smile spread across her face. All right, connections or not, you came here with me, and I have complete faith in your abilities. As for wanting my job, well, you'll just have to wait your turn. She added with a playful grin. After all, I'm still young, and the company isn't looking to create 2 director positions just yet. I smiled back. Then I'll just have to work harder to beat you to it. In the end, I accepted the assignment. After all, our firm was new to the city and needed a high-profile project to establish our reputation. A partnership with the Hayes Corporation was the perfect opportunity, one we couldn't afford to pass up. But even though I had braced myself, when I saw Chloe again, I couldn't help but stare. 5 years had changed her. She carried herself with the powerful, commanding presence of someone in charge, her entire demeanor more composed and severe. The moment she walked into the conference room, her eyes found me at the head of the table and locked on. She said nothing, but her eyes were a storm of emotions that seemed ready to overflow, a raw mix of love and pain. I didn't know where that love and pain came from, and I didn't care. Seeing that everyone was present, I began my presentation. As I spoke, the minutes ticked by. When I finished, the other executives from my firm were clearly pleased. Only Chloe sat there in a daze, watching me, her eyes fixed on my face as I passionately explained the designs, as if I were radiating light. Whatever she had planned to say was forgotten. A look of bewilderment crossed her face. He had changed so much, grown so much. It seemed she was the only one who had remained frozen in time. Ms. Hayes, your thoughts? One of her subordinates asked tentatively, after conferring with his colleagues. At his words, I glanced over and my eyes met hers. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second before I looked away, treating her as if she were a stranger. After a moment of silence, she finally spoke, and to my surprise, she didn't try to sabotage the deal to humiliate me. I didn't truly relax until I saw Chloe sign her name on the contract. After walking them to the lobby with Lisa, I was about to head back inside when a voice called out from behind me, soft and filled with a painful tenderness. Ethan, wait. I stopped. The others around me, as if sensing a shift in the atmosphere, quickly made their excuses and disappeared back into the office. Soon, we were the only two left in the expansive lobby. I was trapped, not knowing whether to stay or go. A heavy silence hung between us. After what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke, her voice hoarse. Ethan, how have you been? The simple question seemed to take all the energy she had. She hesitated, wanting to step closer but not daring to. Just as she didn't dare to ask the question that was really on her mind. I've missed you. Have you missed me? I've been fine. Thanks to the Hayes family's generosity, I had more than enough money to fund my education abroad and live comfortably. In fact, I still had a substantial amount left in the bank, but I had no intention of sharing any of that with Chloe. I looked up at her, my voice flat. Was there anything else, Miss Hayes? The title Ms. Hayes landed like a physical blow. Chloe visibly flinched. She opened her mouth to speak, the corners of her eyes turning red. Ethan, does it have to be like this between us? Before she could finish, I cut her off. I met her gaze, my own eyes devoid of any of the warmth we once shared. Ms. Hayes, there is no us. The words drew a clear, sharp line between us. I still wore a faint, polite smile, but it seemed to send a chill through her, making her tremble. Ms. Hayes, there hasn't been an us for 5 years. There is only you, and there is me. Chloe couldn't accept this. This wasn't the reunion she had dreamed of for so long. Her eyes red, her body shaking, she took a step toward me, her hands reaching out as if to pull me into an embrace. No, Ethan, I love you. You're the only one I've ever loved. When her hands met only empty air, she smoothly pulled them back. With trembling fingers, she unbuttoned the top of her blouse and pulled the collar aside, revealing her collarbone. Seeing the dark ink of the letters there, I froze. The memory hit me instantly, pulling me back years. Chloe, standing in front of me just like this, pulling her collar aside to reveal the 2 letters tattooed on her collarbone. EC. Back then, I had reached out and traced the letters, my heart aching for her, and whispered, "Did it hurt?" She had shaken her head, her eyes shining with a fierce, youthful love. No, but how could it not have hurt? I had seen the way her body trembled uncontrollably. And now, here it was again, an almost identical scene. The familiar letters in the exact same spot, as if they had never been gone. But I remembered it clearly. The first time I saw the news of her engagement to Julian, I had seen her collarbone. The tattoo, the symbol of her once fierce and genuine love for me, was gone, vanished without a trace, just like her love. Ethan, getting a tattoo really hurts. Her voice was small and pleading. That, combined with her trembling body and the redness in her eyes, made her look utterly fragile. I've always loved you. I know you blame me. You blame me for not protecting you, for not being strong enough to choose you. Look, I had it done again, but her display of vulnerability did nothing to soften my heart. Does it hurt? My eyes rested on the tattoo. My question, tinged with what might have sounded like concern, sparked a flicker of hope in her eyes, but my next words extinguished it completely. But what does that have to do with me? I didn't ask you to get it, Chloe, and I don't need you to prove your hypocritical love to me. The cold indifference in my eyes was like a knife twisting in her heart. In that moment, Chloe looked at me and saw an impassable chasm stretching between us. She took a step closer, desperate to bridge the distance between us, to turn back time. But someone else had other plans. "Ma'am, I suggest you watch yourself." A woman's crisp, cool voice cut through the air as a slender, strong hand clamped down on the wrist Chloe had extended toward me. Chloe stared in shock at the woman who had appeared out of nowhere, a sudden sense of alarm rising within her. She wore a simple white blouse, and just by standing there, she exuded an air of cool winter sunlight, languid and detached, like the distant, faint starlight on an autumn night. Her features were nearly perfect, but her eyes were so cold they seemed to freeze you with a single glance, betraying no emotion whatsoever. A chill seeped into Chloe's bones from the hand gripping her wrist, cold and invasive. "Ava, when did you get back? You didn't tell me you were coming." In stark contrast to Chloe's shock, my voice lifted with genuine surprise and pleasure when I saw her. "I just landed. I wanted to see you, so I came straight here." Hearing my voice, Ava released her grip, and as she turned to me, the icy aura around her vanished completely. A small smile played on her lips, but she didn't forget Chloe. She gently pulled me back a few steps, putting more distance between us. "Who I am is none of your business." Chloe stared, her shock slowly giving way to a burning anger and jealousy. She stared at me, her eyes a mixture of disbelief and a silent, demanding question. Who was this woman? But no one answered her. Without a single glance in her direction, Ava and I turned and walked back toward the office building. Ethan, wait! Seeing that we were completely ignoring her, Chloe panicked. She rushed forward and grabbed my arm, her voice trembling. She's just someone you brought here to make me jealous, right? I know I was wrong about everything that happened. You can hit me, you can scream at me, do whatever you want, but please don't joke about this. I felt the warmth of her hand on my wrist and stopped. I looked down at her grip, and a surge of irritation washed over me. I yanked my arm free and took another step back, putting more space between us. My voice, no longer calm, was sharp. What do you want? Why would I need to play games with you? Chloe, don't assume everyone treats relationships like a game, the way you do. The clear rejection and hostility in my eyes struck Chloe like a physical blow, a sharp, piercing pain that made it hard for her to breathe. But more than anything, she couldn't accept that I had moved on. She took a step closer, her eyes pleading. Ethan, you love me. How could you love someone else? Hearing her words, I could only laugh. The mockery in my eyes seemed to send a chill down her spine. She froze, and then I spoke. Chloe, you're the last person in the world who has any right to talk about love. Chloe had never seen me like this before. I wasn't the cheerful, outgoing boy she first met, nor the quiet, withdrawn man I became in her family's home. Now, looking at her, all she could see was my rage. Chloe didn't understand. She opened her mouth, wanting to explain, but no words came out. Her silence didn't earn her any sympathy from me, only a cold scoff. What's this act supposed to accomplish? Are you going to try and tell me that I was the cruel one for leaving? At my words, she shook her head frantically. No, that's not it. Ethan, I know it was my fault. I failed to protect you and I let you down. That's why you left. I know I was wrong. Can you please give me another chance? We were so in love. How could you just walk away without giving me a single chance to fix things? Ava, who had been standing quietly to the side, couldn't help but let out a short, sharp laugh. The sound made Chloe's head snap in her direction, and the image of Ava's hand on my arm flashed in her mind. She gritted her teeth, fighting the urge to punch the woman's smug face. Her eyes slid past Ava and fixed on me, her expression pleading. Ethan, she had barely gotten the name out before I cut her off coldly. If you only stopped me to say these meaningless things, Ms. Hayes, then let's not waste any more of each other's time. I lowered my gaze, my expression once again calm and composed, as if my earlier outburst had been nothing but her imagination. With that, I turned and walked away without another word. Ava took a few steps with me, then stopped as if remembering something. She turned back to Chloe, who was still standing there, looking utterly devastated, and scoffed. 5 years ago, you stood by and let other people destroy him, and now you think a simple "I'm sorry" can erase all that? You've got some nerve, Ms. Hayes. She left Chloe with that cryptic remark, half taunt, half clue, and then turned to follow me. Chloe's eyes flickered. After a long moment, she looked up, a new, desperate hope dawning in her expression. She was right. An apology couldn't be just words. She had to show him, prove to him, that she truly understood how wrong she had been. And the most important step was to get him the justice he had been denied. Julian never expected Chloe to come looking for him. When the housekeeper announced that Ms. Hayes was here to see him, the shock and delight completely overrode his common sense. He was so thrilled he forgot to wonder why she was here, especially after she had slapped him in public at the airport just a few days ago. He checked his reflection in the mirror, then hurried to the top of the stairs before pausing. He turned to the housekeeper behind him. Do I look all right? The housekeeper nodded eagerly. You look wonderful, sir. Ms. Hayes won't be able to resist. Julian beamed at her words. He practically ran down the stairs, but when he saw her sitting on the sofa, his heart seized, and he stopped short. Chloe, you came to see me? Chloe turned to look at him, and the sight of his white jacket made her freeze, a strange look on her face. That day I had been wearing a white jacket too. She frowned slightly, then quickly looked away, her expression returning to its usual cool indifference she reserved for him. Her reaction made Julian's heart pound with anxiety. Did she not like his clothes? But he checked. The housekeeper had approved, and hadn't she just been staring at him a moment ago? Why the sudden frown? Before he could puzzle it out, Chloe spoke. Go change. You're coming with me. Julian didn't hesitate to obey. He changed his clothes in record time, terrified she might leave without him if he took too long. Thinking of the past 5 years of his one-sided, unrequited pursuit, he couldn't suppress a surge of hope. After all these years, Chloe was finally taking the initiative. Did this mean things were finally turning around? Would she finally, truly accept him? I thought that after what happened the other day, I wouldn't be seeing Chloe again for a long time. But just 2 days later, I saw her standing not far from my front door. I forced down my irritation, quickly sent a text, and then walked toward her, stopping a safe distance away. "What are you doing here?" She seemed oblivious to my impatience, her expression as humble and desperate as a spurned lover, eager to prove her devotion. "Ethan," her voice was hoarse, and her eyes were terrifyingly bloodshot. She looked exhausted, but her gaze was bright, filled with an eager, triumphant joy. But unfortunately for her, I wasn't interested. "You should call me Ethan, Ms. Hayes. We're not on a first-name basis." My voice was cold, and my words were like a bucket of ice water dumped over her head. Chloe opened her mouth to speak, a heavy sadness settling in her chest. After a moment, she forced a smile. "Ethan, even if you won't admit it, you can't erase our past. I know you're still angry with me, but I'm going to prove to you that I truly understand my mistakes. The people who hurt you back then, I'll make every single one of them pay. As for Julian, you just tell me what you want to happen to him, and I'll make it so." She tried to step closer, but I subtly moved away. "Just say what you have to say from there. I'm not in the mood for your childish games. If you really want to apologize for the past, then..." I was about to tell her to stay away from me, to get out of my life. But Chloe, as if sensing what I was about to say, cut me off. "I won't give up. Ethan, I love you. I can't live without you. Just give me a little more time. I'll make them pay for what they did to you, I promise. Just wait for me. I won't let a single one of them get away with it." She spoke in a rush, as if terrified of what I might say in response, and then turned and hurried away before I could reply. I watched her retreating figure and said nothing. I just watched her go, a strange sense of anticipation stirring within me. Not a single one. I was curious to see what, exactly, Chloe would do. "Ethan." Just then, another voice called out, closer this time, tinged with worry. Ava rushed up to me, her hands on my shoulders as she looked me over from head to toe. Only when she was satisfied that I was unharmed did she let out a sigh of relief. "Is she gone?" We both knew who she was. I nodded and unlocked my door, then looked back at her. "Come in for a cup of tea." "Don't mind if I do." The kettle began to whistle as Ava slipped off her shoes and followed me inside. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, bathing us both in its warm glow. The apartment wasn't large, but it was cozy. She glanced around the room, her eyes finally settling on me. "Are you settling in okay?" I nodded and smiled at her. "I really like it here." Ava didn't reply, her eyes never leaving my face. After a long moment, she said, "I'm glad I was the first person you thought to call." The words hung in the air, far more intimate than our earlier, more casual conversation. I knew how Ava felt about me, but I just wasn't in a place where I could reciprocate. At least not right now. For now, what I felt for her was mostly gratitude. I had met Ava 5 years ago. I had just arrived in London, and while I wasn't completely helpless, the language barrier and the loneliness of being so far from home left me feeling lost and adrift for a long time. Ava was the first person from home I met there. Later, as we became closer, she would tease me about it, saying that in all her years in England, she'd never met anyone who had moved to a foreign country with no plan, no passion, and no ability to speak the language, and who, after 2 months, still couldn't manage a basic conversation. But I was lucky. I met Ava when she was at her own lowest point. We made a deal. I hired her for a generous salary to be my guide, to teach me English, and to show me the ropes of living in the UK. Seeing that I was drifting without purpose, she helped me discover my own talents and dreams. When my injured right hand made it impossible for me to draw, she helped me train my left. We went from my handwriting being a clumsy scrawl to me being able to sketch flawless architectural plans with my left hand. I wouldn't be who I am today without Ava's help in those early days. But I never expected her to fall in love with me. The first time she told me how she felt, I was stunned into silence. From that day on, I started to pull away from her. She noticed my withdrawal, but instead of backing off, she only tried harder, her pursuit becoming even more determined. It wasn't until I finally told her everything about Chloe and explained that I probably wouldn't be ready for a relationship for a very long time that things changed. That's when Ava changed her approach. She stopped pursuing me so aggressively, but she didn't give up. "It's okay, Ethan," she had said. "I'll be here for you, for as long as it takes for you to heal and open your heart again. And when that time comes, whether you choose me or not, I'll accept it." I had no reason to push her away after that, so I let her stay. Day after day, year after year, until now, I've grown so accustomed to her presence that I turn to her instinctively whenever something happens. The kettle clicked off, the water boiled. I poured the water over the tea leaves, watching them swirl and unfurl in the pot as the fragrant steam rose. Ava's eyes followed my every move. She watched as I pushed a cup of tea toward her, and seeing the tips of my ears turn red, she couldn't help but let out a soft laugh. "Just drink your tea." I pushed her cup closer and muttered under my breath, "Maybe this will keep you quiet." As evening fell, Chloe sat on the sofa in the Hayes mansion, the overhead light casting a small shadow beneath her eyes. In front of her sat the men who had once called Julian their friend, back when the Sterling and Hayes families were equals. The same men who had abandoned him, and even kicked him while he was down, after his family's fall from grace. Julian still remembered the last time he had seen them, trailing after some other rich heir, their faces twisted in sneers as they mocked him. And now, here they were, groveling at her feet, their right hands smashed into a bloody mess. Their screams of agony, mingled with pleas for mercy, were music to his ears. But he put on a show of compassion, tugging on her sleeve. "Chloe, isn't this a bit too cruel?" He didn't see the flash of disgust in Chloe's eyes at his touch. "Cruel?" she said coldly. "They did something wrong, and they deserve to be punished. I'm only taking one of their hands. They're getting off easy." Hearing this, the smile on Julian's face widened. He knew it. Chloe still loved him. Why else would she go to such lengths, torturing these men, just because they had made a few snide remarks at his expense? News spread quickly through the city's elite. The young heirs of the 4 most prominent families had all had their right hands brutally broken. That same day, as I was getting into my car to head to work, everything suddenly went black. When I woke up, I was in a room that felt eerily familiar. It took me a moment, but then I realized it was the room I had stayed in at the Hayes mansion 5 years ago. It was pretty clear who was behind my abduction. I got up and went to the door, but when I tried the handle, I found it was locked from the outside. "Mr. Chun, you're awake? Please wait a moment, we'll go get Ms. Hayes." Before I could answer, I heard the sound of footsteps hurrying away from the door. I scanned the room, and seeing that every possible exit was sealed, I decided to just accept the situation and lie back down. I was curious to see what she had planned. I didn't have to wait long. After just a few minutes, the bedroom door opened, and Chloe walked in, dressed in a sharp business suit. Seeing me sitting there quietly, the corners of her mouth lifted in a small, unconscious smile. The familiar face, the familiar room. If I hadn't been mentally preparing myself for this, the sight might have left me speechless. "Ethan," she breathed, almost unconsciously. I turned to look at her, my expression blank. Chloe seemed not to notice or chose to ignore it. She smiled and began to explain. "Ethan, I had the room restored. See? It's exactly as it was when you lived here before. It was identical. Even the picture frame we had broken the corner of during an argument was there, exactly as it had been, in the exact same spot." It was clear how much thought she had put into this over the years. But what was done was done. No amount of effort now could turn back the clock. "Why did you bring me here? What do you want?" I asked, my lips pressed into a thin line. The silence stretched between us. Chloe looked down, a bitter smile on her face. Her voice was laced with sadness. "Ethan, must we always be at odds like this?" I didn't answer. The answer was obvious. After a long moment, she sighed. "I'm trying to prove it to you. Ethan, the men who broke your hand, I found them. I had their hands broken too. Julian is next." She stepped forward, and before I could resist, she grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the basement. Unlike the pristine bedroom I'd woken up in, the basement was dark and damp. It hadn't been aired out in a long time and smelled of mildew. And in the center of the room, chained hand and foot, was Julian. He was filthy and disheveled. At the sound of the door opening, his head snapped up, a desperate hope in his eyes that Chloe had come to set him free. Chloe had come, but not to free him. As we entered, another man was thrown into the room. A man who had only recently been released from prison, now bound hand and foot. "Ethan, however you want to punish them, it's your call. You don't have to be afraid. I'll be right here with you." She spoke with a raw, undisguised emotion that echoed in the small, damp room. The newly arrived prisoner was the first to break. He burst into tears, grabbing onto Chloe's leg and begging for his life. "Ma'am, I haven't done anything. Please, let me go." Before he could finish, Chloe kicked him away with a look of utter disgust. I recognized him. A flood of terrible memories washed over me. I instinctively took a step back, the color draining from my face as a chill ran down my spine. The next second, I felt a warm hand close around my wrist. I looked up and saw Chloe's face, etched with regret and concern. Ethan, this is my fault. I wasn't thinking. Let me get you out of here, okay? I'll leave them to handle this. Don't worry, I'll make sure everyone who ever hurt you pays. A housekeeper helped me out of the room. In an instant, only Chloe, Julian, and the other man remained in the basement. Julian stared at the woman he had once loved, his eyes wide with terror, as if he were looking at a monster. Chloe, you're insane. You're a monster. Aren't you afraid of what's coming to you? His voice was raw and weak, as if he hadn't had a drink of water in days. Hearing this, Chloe glanced at him, then rose and walked over to stand in front of him. She grabbed his chin, and seeing the terror in his eyes, she laughed. What's coming to me? What do I have to be afraid of? You didn't seem too concerned about consequences when you did what you did. How dare you talk to me about it now? A flicker of confusion crossed Julian's face. What I did? What are you talking about? Realizing there might be a misunderstanding, Julian seized on it like a lifeline. He forced a few tears from his eyes, his face a mask of pathetic innocence. Chloe, you must have made a mistake. Who did what? I honestly don't know anything. His voice trembled, but he tried to sound brave. But the next second, she shoved him away and took out a handkerchief to wipe her hands, as if she had just touched something filthy. Humiliation and rage surged through him, but his situation was so dire he didn't dare say a word. Julian had imagined many ways Chloe might react, but he had never expected her to fly into a rage. The loathing and hatred in her eyes were like a dull knife, slowly, painfully carving him up. But what she said next was even worse. 5 years ago, you orchestrated a little drama that nearly got Ethan killed. Now I'm just returning the favor. You'd better hold on, or this game won't be any fun. Julian felt the blood freeze in his veins. Me leaving just moments ago. The men with the broken hands. Himself, chained in the basement. And this other man, his face both strange and vaguely familiar. The pieces clicked together in his mind, forming a picture he couldn't bear to look at. So, all of this, it's because of Ethan? Chloe didn't deny it. She stood up, her expression confirming his fears. Once you've all paid for what you did, Ethan will forgive me. Then she turned to the other man who was trying to make himself invisible. He's all yours, she said. Remember, the more he suffers, the better your chances of getting out of here. At her words, the man's head shot up, a grotesque smile spreading across his face. He watched Chloe leave, calling after her, "Don't you worry, Miss Hayes. I won't let you down." As the man advanced on him, Julian instinctively tried to scramble away, but the chains held him fast. He caught a glimpse of Chloe's retreating back and finally broke down, sobbing. "Chloe, you can't do this to me. Chloe, I was wrong. I'll apologize. Just don't leave me here. Chloe." The basement was soundproof, but even so, Julian's desperate cries and pleas for mercy seemed to seep through the walls. The people who had once tormented me were now getting what they deserved. It should have been satisfying, but I felt no joy. Chloe knelt in front of me, her voice hesitant. "So, Ethan, are you satisfied? If you're not, just tell me. I'll do whatever it takes to make you feel better, to make you forgive me." I looked up at Chloe, who, even now, looked perfectly composed, not a single crease in her designer suit. The anger that had been simmering inside me still hadn't cooled. Looking at her face, so detached from the ugliness she had orchestrated, I finally understood the source of my unease. "Is this it?" I asked. Chloe was taken aback for a second, then her expression softened into one of indulgence, as if nothing I could say would anger her. "What's missing, Ethan?" My gaze turned cold, my eyes still fixed on her face. "You're missing someone," I said, my voice flat. "Chloe," I said, "they weren't the only ones who hurt me back then." Hearing this, Chloe's expression hardened. She gripped my wrist, her voice tight with suppressed fury. "Who else? Tell me. I told you, I won't let anyone who hurt you get away with it. Do you really not know, Chloe?" My voice was devoid of all emotion, each word a shard of ice that seemed to pierce her, freezing her where she stood. Julian's screams from the basement suddenly became audible. "Chloe, you want revenge for him? You're the one who deserves to pay the most." The blood drained from Chloe's face. She wanted to pretend she hadn't heard, to run away. But I reached out and touched her cheek, and she froze. A sliver of light from a high window cut through the gloom, but it couldn't reach the darkness at the entrance to the basement. I dropped my hand and stood up, walking past her toward the exit. My voice was slow and deliberate, each word clear and unavoidable. "He's right, Chloe. If you really want revenge for me, you're the one who should be paying the price. I was a nobody, an orphan. They wouldn't have even noticed me if it weren't for you. To people like you, people like me are invisible. You were the one who brought me into your world. You were the one who called me your boyfriend while you were flirting with someone else. You were the one who stood by and let them humiliate me. Chloe, all of this happened because of you. Chloe didn't want to believe it. She opened her mouth, wanting to deny it, to tell me she loved me. But a montage of the past flashed through her mind. She saw herself 5 years ago, her face contorted with impatience as she accused me of stalking her, of deliberately burning Julian. She saw herself in the car crash, throwing herself in front of another man without a moment's hesitation. She saw herself on stage, playing the piano with another man, completely oblivious as her boyfriend's hand was being crushed in the audience, and then later, paying to cover it all up, to protect the people who had hurt him. She saw herself when Julian and I were kidnapped, and the kidnappers said she could only save one of us. She chose to sacrifice me in front of everyone. Was that love? Even Chloe herself wasn't so sure anymore. My footsteps faded down the hall, each one a hammer blow to her heart. Every breath she took was a sharp, stabbing pain. But could she just give up? She couldn't. Just as she gathered the courage to go after me, she heard a loud bang. It was followed by the sound of my voice, filled with relief and joy. Ava! We hadn't been separated for long, but in that moment, I felt tears welling in my eyes. Ava, you're here. Hearing the catch in my voice, Ava rushed to my side. She pulled me into a tight embrace, and feeling the warmth of my body against hers, the heart that had been pounding in her chest ever since she heard I was missing finally settled. She rubbed my back, her voice a soothing murmur. It's okay, you're okay now. I'm so sorry it took me so long to find you. When Chloe turned to look, that was the scene that greeted her. If before she could have told herself they were just friends, now there was no room left for self-deception. She watched them, a masochistic pain twisting in her gut. Her feet felt like they were encased in lead. She couldn't move. Her heart felt hollowed out, a desolate ruin. She wanted to go to them, but she couldn't. So, the person Ethan hated most was her. He really was done with her. Chloe's grief was short-lived. Ava hadn't come alone. She had brought the police. Perhaps it was the sounds coming from the basement, but even though Chloe was alone, the officers were on high alert. The Hayes family, one of San Francisco's most powerful dynasties, fell overnight. The head of the Hayes Corporation was taken into custody for questioning in connection with numerous illegal activities, which in turn led to the reopening of a 5-year-old assault case. In the end, Chloe was sentenced to 10 years in prison. The other party involved was sentenced to 3 years for conspiracy to commit assault. However, given that the crime was not successfully carried out, and that the perpetrator himself was seriously injured and mentally unstable, his sentence was suspended. The price was that he would spend the rest of his life in a psychiatric hospital. Chloe confessed to everything. She had only one condition. She wanted to see me one last time. After much hesitation, I agreed. But I didn't go alone. In the prison visiting room, a thick pane of glass separated us. I picked up the receiver, and the distorted voice on the other end sent a strange shiver through me. How had it all come to this? Ethan. It had only been a few months from her arrest to her sentencing, but as we looked at each other, it felt like a lifetime had passed. I didn't speak, just watched her, waiting for her to say what she wanted to say. If I had never taken you back to my family's home, would things have ended differently for us? I still said nothing. If she had never taken me home, we wouldn't have gotten so tangled up. If she had been more decisive, either choosing me or choosing the marriage alliance with Julian, so much could have been avoided. If I had never saved her, but there are no what-ifs in life. Chloe was the sole heiress to the Hayes Corporation. Once her memory returned, she was never going to stay with me in that tiny, run-down apartment forever. Once she returned to her family, she could never completely ignore her parents' wishes. But going back even further, I know I could never have just left someone to die in an alley. After a long silence, Chloe looked at me and a small, sad smile touched her lips. Ethan, I still owe you an apology. I failed you and I hurt you. I'm sorry. I stood up abruptly and placed a cream-colored envelope on the counter. I'm getting married, Chloe. From now on, let's just pretend we never met. I left, but Ava stayed. With me gone, Chloe dropped her facade. Her face was a mask of cold impatience. She didn't see any reason to speak to this woman and stood up to leave. But at the door, she paused, then walked back to the glass. Take good care of him, it was all she said. Hearing this, Ava smiled. She looked at Chloe, a cool, knowing smile on her face. I'm not like you. I'm not fickle. I don't take what I have for granted. I waited 5 years for him. I would die to protect him. I wouldn't deny my love for him just because he saw me at my lowest point. I can do what you couldn't, Chloe. I only stayed to tell you that what you owe him is far more than just an apology." With that, she hung up the phone and walked out. A year later, a heavy snow blanketed San Francisco, covering the city in a layer of white. I walked down an aisle strewn with flower petals, the officiant reciting the familiar words, witnessing the union of another new couple. "Ethan Chen, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death do you part?" "I do." "And do you, Ava Miller, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death do you part?" Ava turned to me, her eyes shining with a love that had never wavered. A smile touched her lips as she answered, her voice firm. "I do." The wedding was broadcast live across the city, reaching every corner of San Francisco, including the television in the common room of the prison where Chloe was incarcerated. The next day, Chloe was found dead in her